Hi, baby angels. It's Phoebe. It's been a minute. I've been really busy at work. I don't know. I don't want to get into it. Let's just have some fun. I am doing a VR to Mags Black's 90s tarot tag. I don't remember what it's called. Is it just 90s tarot tag? 90s vibes? 90s feels? Well, I'll put it. It'll be, you'll know because it'll be in the title. And I'll probably put it in the description too. I have a big stack of decks that remind me of the 90s. Whether these are valid or not, we'll see. I wrote some notes so that I'm not repeating myself too much. That's the goal, and hopefully that's what will be executed. I'm going to start with the Black Lilly. This was on another video. I forget who included it. It's been a minute. I haven't even used YouTube for a minute because my days have just been really, really full. And then when I get home, I'm exhausted and I don't want to do anything. So this is the Black Lilly Tarot. It obviously has some pen and then it has some watercolor, and it's very, sorry if you can hear those sirens. They just passed. Okay. It's very organic looking, very grunge, kind of messy, imperfect, right? So what did I write in my notes? I wrote that this reminds me of dark comics from that era, like alternative comics, grunge. It also reminds me of Riot Girl. I know that it has this is one of the reasons I love it too, is that it has this very vintage lingerie thing going on, but it doesn't feel of the time. The art style isn't of, like, this looks very 40s to me. The haircut, the hairstyle, and the underpinnings, but it doesn't look like it was drawn in the 40s, right? It looks like it was drawn in the 90s to me. Or that it could have been drawn in the 90s. And that, like, this deck plausibly could have existed at that time. It's definitely a very shadowy deck. This is what I mean when I think grunge. It's kind of like gritty. Feminine forward, which is why I say Riot Girl. It has a very rebellious nature to it, because you wouldn't, let's say, you know, traditional patriarchy gender roles wouldn't put this sort of in-your-face brashness or darkness along with femininity or strength, you know? More vintage looking stuff again. But I mean, vintage and rockabilly and that kind of thing, you know, was a legit subculture of the 90s too. So I feel like that tracks. It works. So that's the Black Lilly. I'm not going to show, because I have a substantial amount of decks, I'm not going to flip through them a ton. Or I'm going to try not to, because I tend to do like the whole deck and I'm trying not to be like that. Outgrow Yourself is my second deck. This one also is grungy to me. I think I would have watched a cartoon that had this aesthetic. I think I would have loved this as a kid, even though I was also like a real girly girl and still am to this day. I have that two-sided thing, right? I've got attraction to the dark and mysterious and alluring, and messy and cool and weird and edgy, and then I've got, you know, the attraction to like the sweet, the gentle, the soft, the innocent, the pure, that type of thing. So this one also, the bright colors kind of remind me of the colors that like went on trend after Clueless came out. I don't know. Is anyone seeing that? Like the red bow on like Dion's hat and the yellow suit and the blue. That might be a stretch to some people, but I don't know. This feels, especially with whenever they do kind of a messy and non-typical handwritten font, it makes me think 90s, like this. Because I know that there are a lot of like calligraphies nowadays that are considered modern calligraphy. P.S. Where can I sign up for like a traditional calligraphy class? Because that's almost impossible for me to find. Any calligraphy class that I find is a modern calligraphy, and I'm not really a huge fan. And it's not that I dislike it to this like really intense place. It's just that like I don't feel the need to know how to write like that, and I'd rather know how to write Old English, you know? So if anyone knows of an online class or something that I can purchase or attend, that would be really, really cool. So yeah, I think that I would just love this if I was a kid or a teenager. And I also think that it reminds me of some of the illustration style of when I was a kid as well. Maybe not the context, obviously, but it looks like this could be a children's book as far as what the line drawings look like. And I really like that. And it does feel kind of punky to me too. Such a unique, wonderful deck. I'm so glad it's in my library. The next deck is the Tarot of the Secret Forest, and I just associate fairies with 90s. If you don't, I'm so sorry, but like that was the decade of the fairy to me. I could see someone argue that the 80s were too, and I could take that argument, but the 90s, yes. Okay, what are my notes for this? Okay, the muted dark color scheme is very 90s to me. I feel like the earthy colors, but more in a muted way. Like in the 70s, it was more earthy, but brighter colors. And this is less saturated, or when it is saturated, it's more on the gray side, or it's mixed with muted like this. These images are very, very 90s to me. I feel like I saw these colors a lot in the 90s. People's living rooms were these colors. Maybe not like the walls necessarily, but, you know, accented. I saw a lot of art that had like a rusty, muted tone to it. Even this plaster effect that goes through the whole picture, I feel like that's 90s. This wash feeling. Yeah, as well as the fact that this is fae. And there was a lot of interest in fae in the new age, I feel like, in the 90s. This reminds me of Little Mermaid every time, and I would have bought this deck just for this, because I just think it's Prince Eric. Like, this was definitely something that would have been in my mom's house in the 90s. Or I would have seen something like this in my neighbor's house. Moving right along. The Dreaming Way Tarot. And you might be like, BB, what the heck? What does this have to do with the 90s? And I will tell you. I mean, I could start with this spiral sun and moon. Let me get it out. So this one really reminded me of childhood like storybooks and nursery rhymes and things like that. And one of the examples I have is there was this children's author of picture books named, and illustrator actually, named Tommy DePaola. I think it was Tommy. I don't think it's Tommy. And these when it comes to kind of the color scheme and the context of some of these cards, really reminds me of Tommy DePaola. So let me see if I can find, yes, okay. So this type of thing with the checkerboard, Tommy DePaola did a lot of that in his books. And also the reference to kind of a time where we had knights and kings and things like that. Not all of his books had that inclusion, but it just reminds me of that. And his lines were thicker than this artist's lines, so it's not necessarily the art style that is the same, more like the color palettes and the context of some of these, if that makes any sense. So that's like one example, but it very much reminds me, and I've talked about this before, but like this type of thing also very much reminds me of children's stories and the way that they were depicted and shown visually in media in the 90s. It makes a lot of sense to me. Shout out if you feel the same. Some of these obviously don't feel that way, but a lot of them do call back to that feeling for me. The colors of this, the patterns, the watercolor and pen. Maybe that was like a trend too in kids' books. And even in, you know, kids like media on TV. It feels very nostalgic. Next is the Invisible Light. Am I like in a good frame? I hope so. I'm really sorry if any of these are cut off. It's like every time you take a break, and it wasn't even an intentional break from making videos. I just, you know, didn't have the time or energy and like wasn't super feeling like I was anxious to start any video necessarily. You have to get back into the groove, and it's always weird. I don't know. Like it's like riding a bike, but it takes a second to jump back into, like the water's cold at first, you know? Okay, the next one's Invisible Light. This deck reminds me of MTV in the 90s. It reminds me of music videos. It's very cinematic in that way. It reminds me of the alternative music scene. That's probably the qualities of using a film camera, which is what this looks like. It is film photography. And the lighting feels very 90s. This washed out like filter or film feels super 90s. Like all the grain in some of these photos. There's like an alternative rock feel. There's kind of like a grunge feel to some of them. Sorry, nudity warning. I feel like there was nudity in one of the earlier ones too. Oh, in my first deck in Black Lilly. Welcome to my channel. So yeah, you see it, you get it, right? 90s vibes, 90s music video vibes. If that's not in a Red Hot Chili Peppers video, I don't know what it is, you know? All right, so the next one is the Celestial Tarot. This one may not be like 90s art style. It may be 80s, it may have been 2000s, who knows? But it just reminds me of my childhood, and like this is what I would expect to see in a new age store when I was a kid. The font, the color scheme, it feels like very adult, but in the way that how I viewed, I don't know, adult illustration when I was a kid. Like this would be very mystical, you know? And I could see someone using this on like My So-Called Life, or maybe not 90210, but you get it. I feel like it's very iconic, and the qualities about it remind me of my childhood, so that's why I place it in the 90s in my head. I love all this like space, but it's like astrological, what do they call that? Like galactic, I don't know, it's so beautiful. I think it's so, so cool. I love this deck. I have not used it at all, like full disclosure, but it's newer to my collection and I love it. It's so cool. Okay. I think we're like halfway through, so yay us. Okay, so the next one's the Lioness Oracle Tarot. This reminds me of a lot of things, and it might just be like independent cards, like individual cards that remind me of these things, so hopefully we hit those and I can tell you about them. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind, which is really weird, but like stay with me here, and like I don't know why it's these candles or candlesticks, like, but it reminds me of like the Gregorian chant era of the 90s. Hit me up if you know what I'm talking about. There is this one song that is like iconic to that era and like is sometimes like credited as kicking off that era of like having Gregorian chants be like a trendy cool thing again. If it again as in like, I don't know, hundreds of years before, who knows. And it's called Sadness Part 2, but it's with an E, so maybe it's like Sadness Part, or maybe Part 1 or Part 2, I don't remember which part. And it's by, is it by Enigma? Go check it out. Go listen to that song and relive your childhood. But for some reason, these candles remind me of it. It just feels very, I don't know. Let's just keep going. Let's move on. This whole deck kind of reminds me of that. Like it reminds me of Enya or Enigma. Like that's what should be playing when I'm looking at this deck. The angels are very 90s. Angels were having a moment in the 90s. So that reminds me of the decade for sure. What else? This reminds me of zines because it's cut out. Okay, so this is a perfect example. Like I feel like this image could be in a commercial for an Enya album, or it could be in the commercial for like that one album that had Enya on it, and like also like Moby and like maybe some Yanni and like Enigma, and it was like 90s, like it was like Zen vibes, or I don't even know what it was called. It probably wasn't called that at all, but like this orange and this imagery and like this energy like bursting out in the background, and like I don't know, the qualities of this image and even this instrument here, and then like the rug and everything, this just reminds me of like 90s new age music and culture. Does it not? Even the font feels very 90s. It's very like funky. Maybe it's also like, I think of like Melrose. Like there's this street in LA called Melrose, and it's this huge strip, the Melrose Strip. It's like similar to Sunset Strip, but it has all these independent boutiques, and they were like funky and cool, and like this just looks like the signage of a really cool store on Melrose in the 90s. Like that's what that looks like to me. it's still, Melrose is still there, and it still has all these funky, cool stores, and it has vintage stores and new, like, independent designer stores, and then just, like, boutiques and food, and it goes on forever, but, and, like, high end and, like, low end and everything in between. Like, so 90s. No? Yes. Okay, what else did I write about this? Oh, right, okay. It also reminds me of, and I think it's all of the space imagery, right? Like the stars and nebulas and things like that. It also reminds me of like the call-in psychic aesthetic of the 90s, like the daytime TV commercials where like asking you to call in to like psychics, right? All of this reminds me of the 90s too. And maybe that's just because in magazines, or like I was looking at Smithsonian stuff when I was a kid and seeing bejeweled items and like artifacts like this, or yeah, like this one too. I wonder when she made this. I mean, I know it was newer, but like it just feels so, I don't know. It feels so 90s to me. Like, angels were huge. Okay, you get it. You get it. Let's see if there's anything that stands out. Dolphins remind me of the 90s. Or maybe the 80s too. Yeah, at first I was confused why I even wanted to pull this out. And then when I was looking at it and thinking of like words and feelings, that all came up. So you're welcome. Okay, sacred symbols. This one's really straightforward. It reminds me of like alternative mystics, and it also, like the hand-drawn element of it feels very 90s. This feels like something, a lot of these feel like stuff that would be on the cover of an album, right? These both very much like rock album, grunge album. Yeah, this is like a really simplistic deck, but this isn't as much 90s because I feel like the 2000s are in here. I can see it in the illustration style, but that one's kind of the most, I don't know. I don't want to say modern because it doesn't feel modern either, but you get what I'm saying. A lot of the Egyptian influence is very 90s to me because that's like, Egyptology was like, it was very cool for a second. Like it was a hot commodity. Every kid had like an Egyptology book. And everyone went on vacations to Egypt. I know that like people have been going on vacations to Egypt forever, but you know what I mean? Like it was, let me know if you remember that moment. Okay. So, Abyssal. We have like 4 more, including this one. So, let's do this. Okay. Abyssal Tarot. Let's see what I wrote. The lighting, the colors, the art direction. This is 10 years of photography. So, I believe it was published in 2005. So, let's say the latest that it started was 1995. So, this is definitely authentic 90s. At least some of it. You can see the 2000s creeping in, but we're not going to go into that. The font, the art direction. This deck reminds me somewhat of a fairy book that I had when I was a kid. My grandma gave to me because I liked fairies, obviously. And, okay, what was it called? It was called The Fairies, and it was by Susa Scalora. And it was published in 1999. And it doesn't have it, I mean, like, on one hand, it's not like this at all. And then on the other hand, it very much is. I think, like, the studio quality and the saturated, intense color of film photography at the time, and, like, this was what was in, this type of, like, color contrast and vibrancy and putting colors together that you weren't really seeing a lot of in other decades. That's kind of what it reminds me of. Like, it's not trying to look natural. It's not trying to look candid in the sense that you're definitely, like, you're looking at this and you're like, oh, this is a posed image. This is an image that had a lot of production to it. And that's what the quality of this fairies book reminds me of. Or the quality of, like, this reminds me of the fairies book for sure. The quality of this deck reminds me of, when it reminds me of the fairies book, is like the colors, the brightness, the impact, the, like, high production. And I appreciate it. And I think there's a sensuality that is specific to the 90s that is present here. Let me know what you think. I love that. I love when things feel so of their time. I like a lot of modern things too, but I feel like there are modern things from all the decades as well. I just think it's really, really cool to remember a time as it was and to see it for all of its, like, uniqueness, the things it brought to the world that hadn't come before and, like, wasn't repeated after, you know? But, you know, I'm a Cancer Venus, and I'm very nostalgic and sentimental, and so I'm very attached to things of the past. It's really hard for me not to be. I think also this, like, filigree is so 90s. This whole thing feels very, like, early 2000s to me, but that makes sense, right? Or, like, mid 2000s. But even then, like, in 2004 or 5, if you would have shown this to me, I would have been like, and no offense to the artist or the person who designed this, I would have said it was dated. So maybe it's really 90s. Who knows? Overall, it's a yes. Okay, Mermaids and Dolphins. And you may fight me and say, this is 80s, BB. And I'll be like, you know what? You might be right, so don't fight me. I included this one because if I were a kid, or when I was a kid, let's say, I would have loved and used this deck. And I was a kid in the 90s. I don't remember the 80s. I remember it being 1990. I was 4 years old. So what did I write? I wrote that it's youthful. I wrote that it's pastel. And those are just things I associate with being a child, not necessarily the 90s. But this aesthetic, I loved during that decade. So why not include it? I get a feeling of 80s from the border and kind of like, and I mean, I guess 90s and the border too, because that was still kind of in. This is a deck that I feel like I would have found when I was in elementary school at, like, a store on the Dana Point Harbor, you know, and would have loved it. But then there are elements of the actual images themselves that feel very 2000s to me. And when I went to look up when this was published, it said 2018, but I don't know if that was the first publication of it. Because, like, in my head, it can't be. Because who's making stuff that looks like this in 2018? And I'm not knocking it. I'm just like, wow. Like, I thought I was living in the past. I don't know. Let me look it up. I have the book here. I looked on the box and I looked it up online. Okay, so it was first published in 2007. So that tracks. But I still feel like I'm tapping into a time from the 1900s, okay? All right, can we call it the 1900s now? When we're talking about our own past and not like our grandparents' past. I keep hitting my little table and I don't know if you can tell, but. Okay, 2 more. The Love and Mystery Tarot, and this is straight up 90s. This was made in 1997, so fight me. You can't. This is obviously based off of like Japanese comic book art, and I don't know if it's considered anime because anime is so associated with a certain aesthetic nowadays, but there was such a boom of this type of art in the 90s. I don't know if any of this is centered. Like, please just love me, okay? Just love me. Like, I don't know if this is manga style or anyone who knows about, like, more about Japanese art and comic art. Let me know, because I'd love to, like, learn more about this. Learn more about, like, the different styles of, like, Japanese comic book art or pop culture art, pop art, because it's so cool. This is very 1997. Hello, Pips. Here we go. I bought the deck for this card. I don't know if I said that in my... I probably did in my collection video that featured this deck. It's just very 90s in the color and the style. Like, it's just... It's not 90s reminiscent. It is 90s, you know? So it doesn't require a lot of explanation. It's just, yep, that's it. That's what it was, and it's really cool. And I think this is also sometimes called the Princess... Oh no, I had it up. Like Moon Princess... I'll put it in the description. Just remind me. It's the name of the artist, I guess. But it had two names. And you can, this is out of print, but you can find it. They still sell it on eBay sometimes. I think that may be where I got it. All right, last one, and maybe my favorite as far as the 90s goes. The Da Vinci Enigma Tarot. Like, what were we saying? Enigma, the band. Enigma, the tarot. It's perfect. Everything about this deck screams 90s to me. The art direction, the art itself. I know I've said this a lot in this video, but like having a moment. Da Vinci had a moment. I think the 90s really liked European, like, Renaissance art, and this was no exception. I love the simplicity. The 90s had like a minimalist trend as well. So people who were into that, like, this gallery style feels very 90s to me. Gallery style anything, like, that's the origin in my mind, even though it's not. But like this type of framing and this minimalistic, especially with this type of, like, what I call, I mean, it's a serif font, but it's like a Vogue font, like a Vogue magazine font. If I sound weird, it's because I'm congested, because I had a cold last week, and because I was so busy this week with work that like, it didn't go away. So I'm still very congested. I hope it's not, like, glaring. yeah, so this is just pure Da Vinci aesthetic. This is so 90s to me. I hate these backs. I think they're unintentionally Christmassy. I don't know. I think maybe if they wanted them to be this color, instead of doing like a gray or silver, they could have just done a black lines, like black lines, or white even, and not the gray. I think that would have made it better. I don't know. I'm also not a fan of backs that are different. I know that like the point is that you put them together and they make this whole scene, but I kind of don't care, and like nor do I have the time to do that. I feel like there are so many things that bleed into this aesthetic to me. Like even just like seeing advertisements for department stores, or like going to like Barnes and Noble and seeing things that looked like this, seeing people's homes that have this element of minimalism and classicism, not to be confused with classism, but like this Renaissance mixed with minimalism and mixed with like monochromatic, people's sense of like personal style feeling like inspired by this. Like my first TMI, my first training bra was a like cream colored pointel cotton with a soft blue print of angels on it, like 90s Renaissance angels on it. I should have kept it. I mean, it never would have fit me nowadays, but like I still think about it because it was so good. But like even that I can find like similarities in to this, you know? There were some fun things going on aesthetically in the 90s. I mean, no wonder all the decades come back in style, right? But yeah, I love it. Okay, so that's my 90s vibes or 90s feels collection. Like, what do we think? Do we like? Do we agree? Did you have fun? What are your thoughts? What decks do you have? Why aren't more people doing this tag is my question, because I really think you should. I think it was so fun to look through. Let's see if I can find that one card. To look through these decks and to reflect on the feelings that they give me. Oh. How was your week? Did you have a good week? Has everyone been busy? Is it hot where you are? Like, is it summer? If it is summer, are you going on vacations? Like, I want to know. Cool. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for being curious. Thanks so much for being my friend. My mom's coming. I gotta go.